The WNBA story nobody can ignore anymore. Before you make up your mind on this controversy, wait until you hear the one detail that changed the entire conversation around the WNBA. Because this is not just about one player, one comment, or one viral clip. This is about fairness, fame, pressure, politics, and a league standing at a moment that could define its future for years. If you want real sports stories without the fake hype, hit subscribe right now, because this one deserves the full breakdown. Let's get into it. The WNBA is in a place it has never been before. The attention is bigger, the cameras are everywhere, the headlines are louder, the pressure is heavier, and every single comment now feels like it can spark a national firestorm overnight. That is what makes this story so important, because on the surface, people think this is just another culture war argument, another social media fight, another clip people will scream about for 2 days and then forget. But that is not what this is. Underneath all the noise, there is a real question about women's sports, league leadership, public trust, and what fans actually want the WNBA to protect as it grows. And once you see how all of these pieces connect, the entire story starts to look very different. The first thing we have to understand is this: the WNBA is not fighting for relevance the way it used to. That old conversation is over. The league has already broken through into a new level of public attention. Official league numbers showed the 2024 season became the most watched regular season in 24 years, drew more than 54 million unique viewers across major networks, reached its highest attendance in 22 years, and saw merchandise sales surge by more than 600%. That is not a small jump. That is a full-scale explosion in interest. And when you hear numbers like that, you already know something bigger is happening than the average hot take on television can explain. The league averaged 9,807 fans per game, up 48% from the previous season. It logged 154 sellouts, up 242%. One game drew 20,711 fans, setting a new single-game attendance record. Indiana alone set a single-season team home attendance record with 340,715 fans. So when people talk about women's basketball today, they are not talking about a niche conversation anymore. They are talking about a product that has become impossible to ignore. Now, here is where the suspense really starts. At the exact moment the WNBA is finally getting this flood of mainstream attention, the league is also getting dragged into some of the most explosive debates in sports. And instead of the conversation staying focused on skill, rivalries, records, and stars, it keeps getting pulled into issues that split audiences instantly. That is where names like Brittney Griner and Sophie Cunningham enter the picture, and whether people like it or not, their public comments have become part of a much bigger argument. Brittney Griner has been one of the most visible figures in women's basketball for years. She is a champion, an elite defensive presence, a global name, and someone whose platform grew even larger after her detainment in Russia and return to the United States. When she came back into the spotlight, she made it clear that advocacy was going to remain part of her public identity. In an Associated Press report during her return to the WNBA, Griner said support for LGBTQ+ rights ranked high on the list of causes she would continue speaking on. She also said, "Everyone deserves the right to play," and called separation for any reason a crime. Now pause right there, because that one position is where this story starts to split in two directions. On one side, there are people who hear that and say inclusion matters, dignity matters, safety matters, and sports should not become a weapon used to push people out. On the other side, there are people who say the issue is not hatred, and it is not about denying anyone's humanity. They say the issue is competitive fairness, protected spaces, and the original purpose of women's sports. And then Sophie Cunningham stepped directly into that storm. Cunningham's comments became a lightning rod because she said something many people knew would trigger backlash immediately. In reporting from ESPN, she said she wanted to protect young girls in locker rooms and in sports from having to compete against biological men. After criticism came fast, she responded by saying she never said she hated trans people and that she believed in extending love while also speaking what she saw as truth. That is a huge reason this debate refused to die, because now it was not just random commentators online arguing into the void. Now it was active WNBA players expressing completely different views on an issue that cuts right through sports, politics, and identity. And when that happens inside a league that is growing this fast, every word hits harder. But the real twist in this story is not just that players disagree. Sports have always had disagreements. The twist is that the WNBA's biggest era of growth is unfolding at the exact same time the league is being asked to answer questions it does not seem eager to define publicly. That matters more than people realize. According to ESPN's reporting on the Cunningham controversy, the 2026 collective bargaining agreement states that only players who are women are eligible to play in the WNBA. But there is no further public definition available in that article, and the league had not publicly clarified its policy when asked. That kind of ambiguity is exactly why debates like this spiral. When a league does not clearly explain where it stands, the vacuum gets filled by activists, commentators, podcast clips, TV panels, outrage accounts, and political agendas from every side. And once that happens, the conversation stops being managed by the league. It starts being owned by the loudest people in the room. That is what has made this so combustible. Because fans are no longer just debating what is fair. They are also asking why the answers always seem to come from everybody except the people running the sport. Now let's add another layer, because this is where the temperature of the story really rises. The women's sports fairness debate was already raging far beyond basketball. Swimming, track and field, combat sports, and school athletics had all become part of the national argument. Public figures like Joe Rogan had already criticized transgender participation in women's sports from the angle of competitive fairness, especially in relation to physical advantages tied to male puberty. Whether people agree with him or not, his message has reached millions, and that means these arguments do not stay inside sports circles anymore. They spill into mass culture. And once that happens, the WNBA is no longer just managing a basketball story. It is managing a national symbolic story. That can be dangerous for any league, because if you become the stage where everybody else fights their ideological battle, your actual product can get buried underneath the noise. And this is exactly why the next part matters so much. At the same time these debates are exploding, the WNBA has real basketball momentum that should be the center of everything. Caitlin Clark's arrival accelerated that momentum in a way that official numbers make impossible to deny. The league credited her with record-setting achievements on the court, including the WNBA single-season assists record at 337. The single-game assists record at 19, the first 2 triple-doubles by a rookie in league history, and rookie records for points and three-pointers in a season. But Clark's impact was never just about the stat sheet. She became a ratings event, a ticket event, a merchandise event, a conversation event. And that is the opportunity the league cannot afford to waste. Because when a sport finds a player who brings in casual fans, younger viewers, new sponsors, sold-out arenas, and non-stop media attention, that is the moment a league either builds something lasting or trips over its own politics and confusion. That is why this controversy feels bigger than the average debate clip. It is landing at the worst possible moment for league leadership and the most revealing possible moment for fans. Think about how fast the energy around the WNBA changed. The old story was survival. The new story is scale. The old question was whether people cared. The new question is what kind of league they are being asked to care about. That is a massive shift. And when that shift happens, every unresolved issue becomes more expensive to ignore. Here's where a lot of people oversimplify the story. Some want to reduce it to this: if you support inclusion, you are right, and anybody asking fairness questions is cruel. Others want to reduce it to the opposite: if you support fairness protections, you are right, and anybody arguing inclusion is destroying women's sports. But real audiences are more complicated than that. Most people are not living at the extreme ends of this argument. They are trying to figure out where compassion ends and where competitive structure begins. That is why this debate keeps returning. Because sports are not just about feelings. They are also about categories, rules, boundaries, eligibility, divisions. If sport had no categories, it would stop functioning as sport. Weight classes exist. Age groups exist. Men's and women's divisions exist. Paralympic classifications exist. Every organized sport relies on structured lines. So, the question people keep coming back to is not whether every person deserves respect. Most agree on that. The question is, what rules create fair competition in a women's professional league? And if the league cannot answer that clearly, the audience will keep answering it for them. That is the deeper crisis here. Not just disagreement, not just backlash, not just noise, a trust crisis. Because fans can handle hard rules if they believe those rules are honest. What they struggle to accept is vagueness, selective language, and leadership that appears reactive instead of clear. And that is why Sophie Cunningham's comments hit such a nerve, not only because of what she said, but because so many people felt she said aloud what the league itself was unwilling to define publicly. Whether you agree with her or not, that is why her words traveled so far. And then came the next turning point. Instead of the controversy fading, it started feeding on itself. Media outlets focused on reactions. Activists organized demonstrations. Rival crowds showed up. Opposing sides tried to claim the meaning of women's sports in real time. ESPN reported multiple rallies connected to the Cunningham debate, with strong responses from both supporters and critics. At that point, this was no longer a stray comment from one player. It had become a rolling national storyline. That is when leagues usually panic, because the one thing executives hate most is when they lose narrative control. And yet, if we are being honest, that control was already slipping long before any rally happened. The reason is simple. The WNBA is now too visible for internal ambiguity to remain internal. Everything becomes public faster. Every silence gets interpreted. Every lack of clarity gets turned into a headline. Every player comment becomes a referendum. That is the cost of relevance. And that is also the price of growth. A smaller league can hide from unresolved contradictions longer. A bigger league cannot. Now let's be fair here, because this matters too. The WNBA is not the only sports organization facing this issue. Far from it. State legislatures, courts, school systems, national governing bodies, and international federations have all been forced to deal with it. Policies vary widely. Some states restrict transgender girls and women from female school sports. Other states allow participation. Some governing bodies have tightened eligibility rules in certain sports. Others are still revising frameworks. So this is not a problem unique to one league. It is part of a larger conflict across sports. But the WNBA does face one unique challenge. Its current rise is tied not just to sports interest, but to cultural visibility. That means every controversial issue around the league gets amplified beyond the court faster than usual. And if the league becomes known more for political flashpoints than for basketball excellence, it risks turning short-term attention into long-term instability. That is the trap. Attention is not always loyalty. Clicks are not always trust. Noise is not always growth. A league can trend every day and still lose the public if people stop believing the product has a clear identity. That is why the smartest thing the WNBA can do is not to hope this debate disappears. It won't. The smartest thing it can do is define its position with clarity, respect, and consistency, then let basketball reclaim the center of the stage. Because right now, the sport has enough stars to carry that stage. Aja Wilson has delivered historic dominance. Clark has brought unprecedented eyeballs. Angel Reese has drawn huge interest. Established veterans still matter. New rivalries are real. Arenas are fuller. Viewership is up. Merchandise is flying. The game itself is in a better place than critics want to admit, which makes this whole situation even more frustrating. Because the basketball is finally giving the league exactly what it needed, and yet the surrounding chaos keeps threatening to hijack the moment. Let me say something important here. If you are a fan of women's basketball, you do not have to agree with every public figure in this debate to understand why people care so deeply about it. And you do not have to join every outrage cycle to see the core issue. Fairness matters, safety matters, dignity matters, clarity matters, and if a league tries to speak to only one of those values while ignoring the others, it creates the kind of fracture we are watching now. That is the balancing act, and very few institutions have handled it well. What makes the current WNBA moment so fascinating is that it is exposing more than one thing at once. It is exposing how powerful star-driven growth can be. It is exposing how fast sports stories become political stories. It is exposing how media ecosystems reward conflict. And it is exposing how dangerous it is for leadership to leave major questions half-defined while everyone else fills in the blanks. That last point may be the biggest one of all. Because most fans are not looking for perfect language. They are looking for honest language. They want to know what the league believes. They want to know whether women's sports will be protected in a way that makes sense competitively. They want to know whether respect for people can exist without pretending every athletic category is meaningless. And they want to know whether the people running the league understand just how high the stakes are now. Because these stakes are no longer theoretical. When attendance jumps 48%, when there are 154 sellouts, when more than 54 million viewers tune in, when merchandise spikes more than 600%, you are not operating in a quiet corner anymore. You are shaping one of the biggest live debates in sports culture. That is why this story matters, even if some people are tired of hearing about it. The WNBA is not just growing, it is being tested. Tested on policy, tested on messaging, tested on leadership, tested on whether it can turn popularity into durable credibility. And here is the detail that keeps me coming back to this entire story. The biggest threat to the WNBA right now may not be criticism from outside. It may be confusion from inside. Because outside criticism can be survived, but internal uncertainty, mixed signals, and a leadership vacuum at a moment of explosive growth, that can define a league for a long time. And fans can feel that. They can sense when a sport is being pulled in 10 directions at once. They can sense when players are carrying public debates the league should be capable of addressing itself. They can sense when the headlines are getting bigger but the answers are not. That is why people keep watching this controversy. Not only because it is dramatic, but because it feels unfinished. Like something bigger is still coming, like the league has not truly had its defining response yet. And maybe that response will decide more than people think. Maybe it will decide whether the WNBA is seen as a confident league with a clear competitive philosophy. Maybe it will decide whether fans trust its leadership during the most important growth window in modern league history. Maybe it will decide whether the public remembers this era for elite basketball or endless argument. That is the real suspense in this story. Not just who said what, not just who got criticized, not just which clip went viral. The real suspense is whether the WNBA can protect its momentum before controversy becomes its identity. Because once a league becomes known more for what people are fighting about than for what players are doing on the court, fixing that image gets very hard. Still, the opportunity is there. The numbers prove it. The stars prove it. The audience proves it. Women's basketball is not asking for permission anymore. It has arrived. The question now is whether the people guiding it can match the size of the moment. And that is why this debate is not going away anytime soon. It touches biology, law, culture, fairness, language, activism, media incentives, and the future business of women's sports all at once. That is why every side believes the stakes are bigger than one interview or one soundbite. Because they are. This is about the shape of the next era. If the WNBA leads with clarity, it can come out stronger. If it continues letting the loudest voices define the terms, it risks wasting one of the greatest momentum swings the league has ever seen. And that is the part nobody in power can afford to ignore. So when you see another headline, another clip, another panel screaming over this issue, remember what is really underneath it all. A league finally rising, a fan base expanding fast, players speaking from very different convictions, a leadership structure being pushed to answer harder questions, and a future that still hasn't been fully decided. That is why this story feels different. That is why people keep circling back to it. And that is why the next move matters more than the last quote. Because the next move will tell us whether the WNBA is ready to own this era, or whether it is about to let the biggest opportunity in its modern history get swallowed by confusion. And trust me, what happens next could shape far more than one season.